I wanted to share with you today my recipe for my easy artisan bread. I love this bread. I was introduced to this about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm a terrible yeast sandwich bread maker. I just really struggle with it. So my friend gave me this recipe and I tried it, and it's never failed me. You can do some fun add-ins with it, which we'll talk about later, but let's go ahead and dive into the recipe. So the ingredients for this easy artisan bread are super easy, and there's only 4 ingredients. You've got 3 cups of flour, 1/4 teaspoon of instant yeast, 2½ teaspoons salt, and 1½ cups warm water. Cheap, easy ingredients. Hopefully you have these already stocked in your pantry. Okay, so before you get started making the bread, you need to make sure you have the proper pans. There are a few different types of pans you can use. I have started out with just this type of pan. It's a Pyrex 2-quart casserole dish, and obviously the bigger the pan, the smaller the pan, you may need to adjust your bread size that you put into it. The most important thing with the pans is you have to have a lid. It's the lid that conducts the heat back down to the top of the bread to give it that nice crispy crust. I've tried doing it on a baking sheet without anything on top, and it does not work. So you can start out with these. I personally like to pick these up at my local thrift store. You can find them really cheap. And then also I was gifted one of these amazing clay terracotta bread pans, and this is the Romertopf, and it's got a lid, it's clay. There's the inside. I think these retail for like $80, but again, I have managed to pick these up at my local thrift store and they are awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and put this together. So I always triple this recipe. It just fits best in my oven, and I can whip up 3 together. So if I'm tripling, I'm gonna have 9 cups of flour, so I've already pre-measured that. And this is just regular old flour, nothing fancy. You can use the store brand, it's totally fine. So you have your flour, and then you have 1/4 a teaspoon yeast. So times 3, that would be 3/4, and honestly, I've flexed it and done something close to a teaspoon, and it just works out fine. So there's rounded up kind of a teaspoon of yeast if it's tripled. And then the big one is the salt, and the salt is what makes this bread so yummy. So let's get this measured out. This will be tripled. This will be 7½ teaspoons of salt. 7½. This is not a low salt bread, but it's so yummy. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stir the dry ingredients together first, just so that they combine really easily. Do it in a big pan. It's going to sit. It doesn't raise super high because it raises slow. Actually, I don't know why, but it just doesn't. You do let it sit for a long time, but I've never had to punch this bread down. This is tripled in this type of pan. And then the water is warm water, so tripled. This is going to be 4½ cups, and I've already measured that out. So we're just going to stir this in. And I love this because you don't need a fancy Bosch or a KitchenAid. You just need a spoon and a bowl. So this is perfect for anyone living overseas or in small quarters. Maybe you don't do a lot of baking, so you don't have those tools, but truly the easiest bread once you get the right pans. So we're just going to stir this around to incorporate the liquid, and it just takes a minute or 2. So this is just about mixed in. We'll get a close-up for you in just a second. Okay, so I'm just going to scrape that off. It got a little wet right there, and there's still some residue on the side. Just gonna mix that in. It's kind of it's looking a little dry and a little crumbly, but once it sits for 12 to 18 hours, it'll be fine. And that's the part that's really forgiving. You can just kind of time it to your schedule, and it really can be as little as probably even 10 hours if you needed to, if you needed to get it going sooner. But my schedule is such that let's see, it's about 3 o'clock here. So if I let this go for 12 hours, it would be 3 in the morning. Don't really want to wake up and deal with it then. So we'll let it go for another 6 hours. So about 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will move on to the next step, and we'll have fresh hot bread just in time for lunch tomorrow. Okay, so I'm going to just scrape the dough, kind of sticky, off the knife, and we're going to cover it with some plastic wrap. Couple pieces. You don't need to spray it or anything. I've never had it raise up that tall that it's going to reach the top of it. So just kind of loosely covered with plastic wrap, and then you don't even have to put it in a particularly warm place to rise. It just needs to be kind of out of the way. I tend to put mine in a cold oven and just keep it there just to keep it out of the way. but just make sure you don't turn your oven on to bake cookies or something later on tonight. So if you're worried about that, you maybe just want to keep it on the counter, and then I will set a timer on my phone for about 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, which will be 18 hours, and we'll go on to the next step. Hey there, so it's been actually a little over 18 hours. The recipe says you can let this bread dough raise for 12 to 18 hours, and I actually went closer to 19 or 20, but the bread is forgiving, so I'm sure it'll be fine. So here is what it looks like under the plastic wrap after it's been raising. It looks very sticky and very wet, and there's a little bit of some bubbles in the dough. So we're going to take this off and put down a lot of flour so that it doesn't stick to the counter. And then we're just going to do an easy knead. And because it's so wet, I don't like getting my hands in something that's so wet and just going to stick to it. I scrape it out with 2 just regular knives, just so I can keep my hands out of it until it gets some more flour in it. You know how once your hands get really sticky with the wet dough, it's just a mess. And I just kind of try to work in some flour. Now this is a triple batch. This is just a light knead, super easy. Just gonna do a few more. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna put some flour on my hands and get in here, and really you're just kneading it a little bit. It really doesn't need much. And again, this is why I love this dough. You don't have to have a fancy mixer. You just need some really basic ingredients and supplies. So this is my triple batch of dough. 1 big ball of dough after we've kneaded it really lightly, just by hand, not with a mixer or anything. And I kneaded it for maybe 10 to 15 times, truly under a minute. At this point, you can decide how big you want your loaves to be. This is a triple batch, so typically I would just cut it into 3 equal loaves and put them on my 3 plates. Now, if you have a really large pan and maybe a smaller one, you could do 2/3 of the dough and then a smaller one. I wouldn't recommend mixing these 2 types in the oven just because they cook a little bit differently. But anyway, if you have bigger pans, smaller pans, you can just kind of flex to that. And really probably the first time I would just recommend cutting it into a triple, put it in your pans, and then you'll see what size loaf you get. So from here, I'm going to cut this into 3 loaves. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So there's my 3 loaves. So at this point, I'm going to need just a little bit more. And I really like to get the flour in it and make sure it's got plenty of flour all around. It gives it that really nice artisan look. You just want to kind of smooth it out and kind of look for a smooth top. And basically then just plop it on your plate. This is a little bit sticky inside. You can see it's a little bit wet. So I'm just going to get a little bit more flour in there. So at this point, these are just your balls of dough on the plate. The plate wasn't sprayed with Pam or anything, and it's not sticky. It's got plenty of flour on the top. This one didn't have as much flour as I wanted, so I just sprinkled some on and then kind of rubbed it in. So for this one, a few weeks ago, my daughter was wanting to make bread bowls out of the artisan bread. So we did, and I took this amount of dough and I cut it into 4ths to make bread bowls. They were a little bit small, almost like an oversized roll. So if you wanted to do bread bowls, I would recommend cutting this into 1/3s, maybe even 1/2s. But we're going to try rolls this time. So I'm going to cut this, I think, into 8ths. And we'll try that. And then what I will end up doing is just throwing the balls of dough into this and just kind of lined up next to each other. I've got my 8 rolls here, and you just kind of lightly shape them, lightly knead it. So I'm putting just a little bit more flour as the inside's a little bit sticky, smoothing out the top, and then putting it on the plate to rise. So there's my 8 rolls. So I'm going to put these on the plates, and I've got a damp dish towel here that I'm going to use to cover it. And it says, the recipe says to let it sit for an hour, 1 to 2 hours. Because I let it raise for so much overnight, I'm going to err on the side of an hour. So I'm going to start getting my pans ready and my oven hot, so these will be ready to go in the oven soon. Okay, so it's been about an hour. I'm going to go ahead and get my pans heated. So if you are using the Pyrex pans, at this point, looking at your recipe, you've let it raise for 1 to 2 hours. So this is an hour, and you're gonna put these in the oven to get them warmed up. So you'll place this in a cold oven with the lid on. Wait till the oven preheats to 450. At that point, you'll be taking this out of the oven and spraying it with Pam, and then dumping the bread in and then putting the lid on, putting it in the oven and baking it according to the directions. So you're baking for 30 minutes at 450 degrees, and then taking the lid off and baking for another 10. I'm gonna do something a little bit different at this point because I'm using my fancy terracotta pans, so I'm gonna grab those. Okay, so here I am with my terracotta pots. These I actually did soak in water for 20 minutes. I've heard some people say they don't soak them in water. I like the idea of soaking them. I think that that's one of the ways it adds to a more crispy crust. So they were just soaking in room temperature water for about 20 minutes, and then I put them into a cold oven, turned it to about 450 degrees for about 30 minutes to get them super hot. So these pans now are blazing hot. Please use caution, use lots of hot pads and oven mitts and whatever you need to do. I can feel the heat rising from these. So they're super hot, so we need to be careful. So at this point, I'm gonna take the bread dough. So here's one of my loaves, and this is my biggest pan, so I think I'm gonna put the rolls into that one. So we're going to just take the bread off. Because my pans are kind of oval, I'm gonna just stretch that out a little bit and plop that in. I've also heard people use parchment paper, and you can do that. I'm just not gonna deal with that today, and I think it'll be fine. So then my next loaf is gonna go into this other one. And again, I'm just gonna kind of stretch it out. Not really do too much to it, but honestly, just plop it in. Again, the great thing about the artisan bread is that it doesn't have to fit a certain shape because you're not trying to do sandwich bread or a certain shape for sandwiches. So I'm just gonna plunk them in. So here's the rolls. And I'm just gonna put these in one by one. And again, these are nice and hot. They're not sprayed with Pam or anything. The bread did have plenty of flour on it, so I think they'll be fine. So here's the rolls in there. It kind of looks like a monkey bread or a pull-apart bread. We'll see how it turns out. So I'm gonna put the lid on these, put these into the oven for about 30 minutes, and then open the oven, take the lids off, and let them bake for another 10 minutes. Because my oven size, I had to move the rack down pretty low. I've done it last time where I put the rack too low and they got a little too crispy, burnt on the bottom. Not horrible, they were totally edible, but I raised the rack up just a little bit further so that it's not at the very bottom, but I still have enough headspace. And if you want, you can slash the top of the bread with the sharp knife. I'm just gonna put a couple slashes in that one. Just make it look pretty. I don't know, maybe it helps it cook a little better. And we might cut a couple into the rolls as well. Just a slash. You could do an X if you want. And then this one over here, maybe I'll just do a big X. Not going too deep, just a little for some texture on the top. Usually it cracks open a little bit anyway. Okay, we'll get these into the oven and we'll take the lids off in 30 minutes and then they'll be ready in another 10 minutes. Okay, so here we are. So remember, they went into the oven for 30 minutes at 450 with the lids on, and then after 30 minutes I took the lids off and they baked for another 10 minutes. And I just took them out of the oven. They're steaming hot, and here we go. Isn't that beautiful? We've got 2 regular size loaves and then these beautiful artisan rolls. And I think they're just gonna pop right out, be nice and super crispy. My daughter was just saying it'd be fun to do a braid, like an artisan bread braid. Okay, so those aren't coming out as great. Let me grab something to pop those out. Oh, nice and crispy. I love a good crispy roll. That's gonna be so good to dip in stew or just eat plain with warm butter. And those are sticking for some reason. So next time on the rolls, I may do the parchment paper in the bottom. I don't know if it's just because they're a smaller loaf for some reason, or maybe it was where they were located in the oven. And this is a little bit different finish than these two on the inside. You can see this is a shiny, so that may have something to do with it as well. No worries, that's gonna taste super good. And anyway, let me know if you have any questions. This is just a great way to bake up some bread, especially because we're at home these days. It's easy to stir up, it's easy to put together, and it's delicious. Okay, enjoy the bread.